Recently, I was at a university and I asked the students, because they were getting bored with the subject, which was very dense, that what they wanted to hear about. And I gave them three choices: Netflix, GNU, and climate change. And you will be shocked that all of them actually wanted to hear and talk about climate change. So that's one big step which I think we have covered as a country, that young students are interested in talking and hearing about climate change. So today, the three subjects I would like to discuss are MasterChef, your shampoo, and Fashion Week, because they are all connected to what we are discussing today, circular economy. And as I understand, circular economy is a giant leap forward from recycling, because circular designing has to take place before you create items which can be recycled. That's the big subject. Listen to all the knowledgeable people before me, and that's what I understood. My first experience of recycling was in 1991 in London, when I bought a comb. It was at Body Shop, and I bought the comb because it was written on the comb that I used to be a steering wheel. So that was recycling at that time. I still have that comb, I don't have hair. So why I'm talking about comb and hair and shampoo? We heard today that in Stockholm in 1972, Indira Gandhi said that poverty is the worst polluter. Today in India, the consumption of shampoo is more than 90% in plastic sachets, which are actually not disposed of well. I work with some people, some farmers, who are into organic farming, and they said the biggest crisis we face, that when we are tilling the land and there are these sachets which are there. And that's because of India's poverty, because people of India, at least 80% of them, cannot buy shampoos and other consumer items which are in larger quantity. So what was for our economy a huge bottom of the pyramid gain in terms of poor people buying new things has become now a huge problem for us within 30 years. So that's the shampoo problem. Fashion Week is another problem. In 2007, and these are the data which I quote from The Economist, in 2007, an average Chinese wore an item of clothing 400 times before disposing it off or it got worn off. Today, an average Chinese is wearing a clothing for 200 times. And in the world, we are producing 7 billion t-shirts every year. That's one shirt for one person. And the amount of cotton involved, the amount of water involved in raising that cotton is absolutely unsustainable. And that's why I talk about Fashion Week, because the Fashion Week spurs us to change our clothing. There's fall collection, there's winter collection, there's summer collection, and if there was any other, they don't have monsoon in the West, otherwise we'll have a monsoon collection. That's another big problem. The third thing was MasterChef. MasterChef recently had an episode, which was one of the best episodes I thought they showed, in which they asked the contestants to create a dish out of kitchen waste. I think it was the most compelling. I don't get to watch MasterChef too much, but that one I caught. And the most, there was some Michelin chef who was there as a judge that day. And this was the challenge for the contestants, that how do you do it? That how do you make a recipe out of a duck which consumes the entire duck? How do you use every part of cabbage? That's the kind of thing I think we need to think about. And as a society, as I said, poor people are the, I didn't say it, Indira Gandhi said it. So how can we stop this pollution? And that will be stopped only when we think about consumption and create items of consumption, keeping in mind the design, that what it's going to be in the future and how it can be recycled in the future, how can it be a resource for future consumption. So that's basically, I think, and that's, I think, our subject of discussion today. And I'm really, really overwhelmed by the people who are sitting to my left and my right, because they know more than what I've been able to communicate to you. But my job as a moderator is to just lay the foundations of the discussion. I'm sure that the building would be very good. And I would ask, first of all, Vishvesh Prabhakar, because he has some slides to show that how these three things which we talked about can be addressed in India, because I think these three things in India are the basic, big, huge problems for us: food, clothing, and shampoo. Vishwesh, you want to sit, or are you going to stand? And
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj, for setting the context so eloquently. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, Anders, Pankaj, Mr. Khan, Nishtha, and Saharsh. What I'll do is I'll take the next, I would say, 10-12 minutes sharing our perspectives at Accenture in terms of the context of circular economy. I think it has been at great length and in a very nice fashion explained by the distinguished panelists in the first half of the session today, but I'll delve into that again through some data points. Then I'll actually share our perspectives on circular economy and the topic of today's discussion, design aspects in the circular economy, which is very new and it is very relevant, as Pankaj mentioned, because it really is at the beginning of the entire consumption cycle. And finally, I'll share with you, Pankaj, you mentioned some examples of how we have seen some successful global and India pilots in terms of circular design and circular economy pilots. Many of them have not scaled up, but there are green shoots, and I'd like to share these examples in the context of this audience and the panel discussion. I think it was mentioned by the panelists earlier today. The chart on the right hand, on my left, essentially shows a correlation between economic development and resource consumption. So the x-axis of this chart is GDP per capita, and the y-axis is resource consumption. And you can notice that Sweden is really right at the top corner of the chart. Great strides Sweden has made over the last many decades, from one of the poorest nations in Europe to one of the richest and most innovative nations globally. And you see India. India is essentially at the left-hand side of the chart. Now, what does this chart tell you? Essentially, what this chart tells you that if India has to really achieve even 50% of GDP per capita of Sweden over the next 10 to 15 years, Conventional thinking, it has to really traverse what I call this staircase model of development. And the staircase model of development is essentially going to consume a lot of resources. So that essentially is our research telling us, it's a global research, and this has been the conventional way of development. Now, if we go to the next slide, essentially it kind of brings home the point in terms of where does India stand in terms of GDP per capita when it comes to steel consumption. The global average steel consumption is about 225 kg per capita. India stands at about 71 kg, less than a third. If you look at per capita energy consumption, globally it's about 76 gigajoules. India is one third, about 25. And finally, plastic consumption, the topic mentioned earlier. Globally, it's about 28 kgs, and we are at about 11 kgs, less than 50%. So our per capita consumption is way short of global averages, and this is going to really increase intensity on resources if we go to really follow the same path of development going forward. If you move on, I think the three big challenges which essentially the world has really the focus of growth are really climate change. Climate change is a very, very big challenge. It was talked at length in the session earlier today. Pankaj mentioned in the context of farmers. The second is really resource overconsumption. And paradoxically, the third big challenge is resource inequality. So essentially, the three big challenges are climate change, resource overconsumption, and resource inequality. And we essentially require a fundamental rethink. This slide highlights the quantum of investments which are required to address the problem of water scarcity, or to address the problem of climate change, or to really address the problem of providing electricity access to global population which doesn't have access to electricity. But essentially, we need a new paradigm of growth. And in the next, I would say, 11 to 12 years, talking of sustainable development goals, India's contribution, the analysis tells us, is going to be 50%. So India is going to really contribute about 50% to the global sustainability development goals. So India has a huge opportunity for itself to really chart out and really prove to the world that it can actually raise its hands, it can really embrace and adopt ways of development which are less resource intensive, which are essentially having less impact on climate, and essentially they lead the pathway in terms of new ways of growth. So if we move forward, I think this data was also discussed, the Earth Overshoot Day. The Earth Overshoot Day essentially represents capacity of Earth to regenerate resources in a year's time. This year, the Earth Overshoot Day was essentially in July. We've exhausted the regenerative consumption capacity of Earth 5 months earlier. And if this trend of consumption is going to continue, by 2030, we'll essentially acquire capacity of 3 Earths to really take care of our consumption needs. Now, in this context, circular economy is very important. Now, what exactly is circular economy? If we move on. So essentially, the circular economy and the circular business models essentially look at, 4 things. Starting with design, right through conversion, use, and finally recycle. And I'll take a minute. Essentially, the goal of the circular economy is to really minimize waste and drive innovation. Now, and this can be through introduction of renewable energy in the conversion cycle, fully recyclable and bio-based fuels or materials, and monetizing wasted capacity. There is a lot of capacity which is available, and there is a great opportunity to really monetize capacity which is available to really convert raw materials into finished goods, both from a product perspective as well as from a packaging perspective, and finally services. Lengthen wasted life cycles. This is another element of circular economy, that how do you extend product life cycles through reuse, repair, and remanufacture. And finally, enhance embedded values, prevent materials from going to the landfill, going to the farms, but really extract value, upcycle the products, or essentially extract value from those products to really create new products and possibly services. So these are the 4 building blocks. More specifically in the context of design, and this is the topic of today's discussion, the circular design principles, as we look at from an Accenture perspective, they essentially are a paradigm, and they take into consideration both left brain thinking and right brain thinking, and essentially look at aspects of sustainable material choices, and this includes land, sustainable manufacturing processes, and sustainable labor practices, with a view of making the products and services centered around the 4 R's, which is repair, reuse, remanufacture, and recycle, extending the product life cycles and focusing on aspects of durability, sustainability, and standardization. I wanted to share one example. Pankaj shared the example of sachets, and I was reflecting yesterday. All of us use mobile phones. 100 crore people have mobile phones in India. A lot of them have Android, and a lot of them have Apple iPhones. So the standardization example, which I mentioned in the design stage, if you notice, there is an Android charger and there is an Apple charger. Now, essentially, this helps the OEMs differentiate themselves. It helps them enhance their what we call the accessories or the aftermarket revenues. But essentially, it creates that incremental load on the resources. And standardization is an important element in the framework which I mentioned earlier from the perspective of design from the circular economy principles. I'll share 3 key enablers. The 3 key enablers to drive circular design essentially are design principles, and we enunciated some of them. They are very good examples. The Swedish companies like IKEA have taken the lead, and we'll have a case study from Sandvik later on. We work very closely with Nike, where essentially, they essentially eliminated about 28 million shoes going into the landfills by creating a program with their ecosystem partners to take shoes which have essentially reached end of life cycles and essentially convert them into new recyclable shoes. Collaboration is a very important element. Anders talked about this earlier in the day. Collaborations for efficient design is a very big theme in circular design. And finally, technology. It was mentioned by Haleem in the morning sessions. The problem is created by technology. The solution has to be in technology. So there are many examples where technology like IoT, technologies like AR, VR, and digital twins is being used very effectively to minimize waste and create designs and processes which are more efficient. What this is throwing up is really 4 kind of value chains, 5 kind of value chains. It's the circular value chain, product as a service. You don't buy a product, but you buy a service. Sharing platforms, we are all very familiar with sharing platforms like Uber and Ola, and there are many such sharing platforms even for clothes, product life cycle extension, and finally recovery and recycling. So I'll just stop here by kind of giving the context of the circular economy, and in that context, the design principles and the kind of models it is throwing up. As I mentioned earlier, there are pilots. There is a need for active debate that how do we kind of make this incorporated in our lifestyles, and we work as essentially ecosystem partners to really drive it at scale. So thank you, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Vishvesh, for putting it out on black and white, and I'll be very happy if you can circulate that to organizers and can be circulated
Yes.
among the people here. Thank you very much. And but you did not talk about shampoo. I'm really glad, and 3 cheers to IIC for doing away with the bottles, plastic bottles. Do you know that the world is producing these days 1 billion bottles a day? 365 billion bottles a year. On all kind of things, coffee, juices, water, all kind of things. And that is the problem, that we want also as human beings change, and we want that change to come with us I was recently at Harvard for a conference like this, and I saw that how young people are overcoming this. I was very late, so I could not book a good hotel where I would have found plastic bottles. So I booked into one of those student hostels. And I found, as I went to my room, that there was a recycled plastic bottle for you. So you can keep it, you can go to the fountain, fill it up every day, and you can take it with you. After that bottle, it was in February this year, I haven't used a plastic bottled water ever. So this enablement this is what's lacking in India at a huge level. That's when I talk about the shampoo sachets, the food wastage, and MasterChef and T-shirts. So that's one thing. And women, I'm sorry to also see here that no woman has spoken since morning. And women are a very big part of this. It's part of SDGs, gender equality, and how the governments, how the societies, how administrations, how the business people can engage with women to be part of this. Well, all the three things I talked about, at least, and in Indian context or even global context, that circular designing, the designing for consumption, it starts and ends with women mostly. So we have Nishtha here, who represents women at large in the world and men. So how can do you think the producers, the governments, non-profits, and the society can engage with women when it comes to circular designing?
Sure. Namaskar, Adab. Good afternoon. I'm extremely happy to be here, and I'm glad, Purinji, that you managed to have one woman on your panel, particularly on a topic particularly on the topic of circular economy. Because if you really look into homes, you will notice that women are natural agents in a circular economy. Their lives are not linear, their consumption isn't linear most of the time, and much of their thinking is also not linear. So it's rather awkward to realize that women have been left behind in the discourse.
Yeah.
You want the bottle?
Just
You don't want the bottle. Oh, you want a picture? Okay. So it's quite surprising, and it's rather awkward to have left 50% of the population behind that has a natural design principle or a natural process of thinking which is basically fundamental to a circular economy. Now, how do we engage with women? But before we come to how do we engage with women, I do want to stress a little on why do we engage with women. Because as much as we would think, and as much as both of us probably agree on why it would be obvious